Okay, welcome to History 264. Today's class is the parting of the ways of Orthodox and Conservative Judaism. I am incredibly delighted to bring more friends to take part in a really great scholarly conversation about a really interesting moment in American Jewish history. First is only by alphabetical order, although it's close. Rabbi Zach Silver is the Rosh Beit Sefer at Rochelle Zell here in Chicago, and I think I'm one of the very first. So Dr. Ben Steiner is a newly minted PhD from Brandeis University. So we already had much in common, and now we have even more in common in that regard. And it's terrific to be joined by them. A little bit of background. Rabbi Silver did much of his graduate and scholarly work at the Jewish Theological Seminary, studying conservative Judaism, wrote an incredibly important article, I can say, because it impacted my work so much, on the excommunication of Mordechai Kaplan, and it was published in American Jewish Archives Journal, and is a well cited article, one of the most off-cited articles, I think, from the journal, really over the last 5-10 years. Ben, he eventually did his dissertation, moved like I did to the 19th century, but has published a number of very important articles on conservative Judaism and contemporary or 20th century American Judaism. Also studied for a time at the seminary, doing graduate work there. Both remarkable scholars, even more importantly, remarkable people. And it's terrific. I'm Zev Elif. I'm professor of Jewish history at Touro College and provost of the Hebrew Theological College here in Skokie, Illinois. And all of you who are populating the room as I speak, as a Zoom room, thanks for joining us. This is now, I think, the fourth installment of these Zoom talks. We hope that there's reason not to do these anymore, that we're able to release ourselves into the atmosphere in due time. Good to be safe, though, and along the order of making lemonade out of lemons, we'll have a really great conversation.
Thanks for having us, Ed.
Thanks for joining. We'll move the box out of the way for a bit. The parting of the ways. The emancipation of Orthodox and conservative Judaism from each other. And in some ways, we're challenging a narrative that was really developed by Moshe Davis as early back in the 1950s and 1960s, which suggested that conservative Judaism came out of the 19th century. There was this historical school, these people who didn't call themselves conservative Jews, people like Isaac Leeser, Bernard Illoway, enlightened people who would much prefer and did describe themselves as Orthodox Jews, but they were the forerunners of a conservative movement. Davis's book, still much used, there was a lot of pushback, particularly by Charles Liebman, who said, well, if they're conservative Jews in the 19th century, show me a postal address. Show me how they identified as conservative Jews. Other people have offered different suggestions. Marshall Sclair argued that conservative Judaism came out of the laity. He wrote a book called Conservative Judaism that made that argument. And most recently, a guest on the first installment is Mike Cohn on the birth of conservative Judaism. That's his book, appeared in 2012. That's the latest argument, is that conservative Judaism came about through Solomon Schechter's disciples, meaning that the rabbinate that emerged out of JTS from 1902 to 1915, these disciples of Solomon Schechter were the ones who grappled with, should we start a new movement? Can we coexist or exist within an Orthodox framework? And those deliberations, those encounters, sometimes settling, sometimes unsettling, was what catapulted a new movement called conservative Judaism. Either way, I think the three of us are going to probably side more with the latter two approaches, that being Sclair and Cohn, not much Davis, and really discuss if conservative Judaism came out of an orthodoxy, not necessarily an Orthodox movement, but an orthodoxy. How did that happen? How did the two move away from one another? And I think what I'm excited to explore is that it's not just one answer, is that there were a variety of historical factors and determinants of change which caused this to come about. Make sense? So I want to begin with a story. Anybody who's driven through Brookline on Harvard Street knows that there's this tremendous synagogue called Kehillat Israel. Can't miss it. It's right near the pita joint. And this congregation emerges in the 1920s, just as Brookline, a suburb of Boston, starts to get populated with more and more Jews. KI builds this huge edifice. And its president, Joseph Rudnick, not the picture of Rabbi Louie Epstein, we'll get to him in a moment, but Joseph Rudnick offers the following in a newsletter for KI, for Kehillat Israel, the Kehillat Israel Chronicle. The president's appeal. The problem of the sitting arrangement, mixed seating, separate or mixed seating, at our temple was thoroughly debated at the meeting of February 25th and fought out, very stark language, with an Australian ballot in accordance with a petition signed by 7 members of good standing who demanded that such a vote be taken, meaning it was done anonymously. The result of the vote is known to all. So what had happened, there was an element within KI which identified in its first couple of years as Orthodox, whether or not women should be removed to the synagogue, to the women's gallery in the synagogue, or if they should sit along with their husbands, their fathers, and their sons. At first, writes Rudnick, when this question came up before the board meeting and members at large, I expressed my opinion and hoped that Kehillat Israel would remain in every way an Orthodox congregation. And I had hoped that we would have a sufficient number of Jews in Brookline of the type that would support a strictly Orthodox synagogue. So Rudnick was not part of the element that supported mixed seating. There were, however, an overwhelming majority of people who had given money toward the erection of the temple and who felt that this congregation should be, these were the younger people, should be what is called a modern Orthodox congregation. Not the way that we would term modern Orthodox today, but here you have, if the congregation had voted against mixed pews, it would have been a strict Orthodox congregation that had adopted family pews, mixed seating between men and women. It was no longer a strict Orthodox, but it wasn't conservative either. The nomenclature it deployed, its president did, was a modern Orthodox congregation. So first I want to ask Zach and Ben, what's gained and lost by this terminology? We're not yet ready as an American Judaism to use this de jure term, conservative Judaism, although conservative Judaism means much more than just mixed pews. But that was one of the great indicators eventually, as we will see. But what's gained and lost by this interesting terminology, this movement from a strict Orthodox to a modern Orthodox congregation or community?
So I think one thing, and I think we'll get to it, is that it differentiates this particular congregation from other institutions in the Orthodox world, particularly, as we'll touch on in the near future, the Ha-Rabbonim, which is, some people might consider them even a pre-modern type of organization, which was really trying to operate and have authority over the Orthodox community in ways that a lot of people were uncomfortable with. They were particularly trying to assert their control, their sole control, to be honest, over the kashrut industry in particular. And it's just 2 years prior, right, to this. In 1923, the OU gives its hashgacha, gives its kashrut certification to Sunshine Crackers, which is famous to many of us because they are the certifying. The Sunshine Crackers are the originators of Hydrox cookies, the prototype of the Oreo. for those who couldn't eat Oreos for a while. So by declaring yourself modern Orthodox, among other things, you're distinguishing yourself from them being agudas rabbanim, who, among other things, don't speak English in Shul. They speak exclusively Yiddish, and certainly are not going to even preach in English toward what's becoming a very American crowd.
Yeah, I think Zach has definitely hit it on the nail. I just want to emphasize another element of this, which is that the moment at which this is happening, after they dedicate a new synagogue, really reflects a larger phenomenon where we have synagogues moving towards reform or towards reforms after the construction of a new synagogue. That was sort of the central moment, if you look across the country, after the Civil War, to reform Judaism. And here again, it's a trend, part of a larger trend of using the construction of a magnificent edifice to push for liturgical and synagogue reforms.
And this congregation, though, is sort of holding the line as a traditional congregation. So there's an elasticity there. It's trying to grab as many people, and some might consider, and some still do consider, modern and Orthodox to be very divergent words. They're a contradiction in terms, or in a term. Here, if you can get away with it, calling yourself modern Orthodox keeps you within the traditional segment of the American Jewish community and reaches as far as it can go, not quite in the Reform circles, but can grab as many people who trigger a term of identification would be co-signed with something close to modern. And so it grabs a lot. Yeah?
Sorry, just panning out as well, immigration is largely halted for Jews. That the immigration wave is 1880 to 1920, give or take. And this is shortly after that. And so this is a simultaneously bringing forward the European community that's come over, primarily Ashkenazi at this point. But there's something decidedly American about this as well. So the fact that we are changing a term is a decidedly American phenomenon. And it's not unique to Judaism either. People are trying to figure out, what is American religion going to look like?
Right, and I love that by 1924, certainly migration has slowed down to a trickle. So you have a stagnant population. And so to give them a language to identify themselves becomes all the more important, because they can't import people or import terms from Eastern Europe. I think you're absolutely right. It's really, really important. Louie Epstein, we'll get to it, and Ben's done significant work on him. He's not quite yet the rabbi. He will eventually be the longtime rabbi of Kilat Israel. Here, Rudnick is operating a lay-led congregation, but Epstein is very, very involved in solving the Aguna crisis. And part of modern Orthodox, and what, not just how we term it, but how the contemporaries define it. One example, and here I'll move our box a little bit. Maybe I'll make us that small, shrink us, is here on the left and the right side. You have an example of how modern Orthodoxy manifests. You have Solomon Zukro, an important scholar at Boston's Hebrew College for many, many decades. He writes in a book dedicated to solving the Aguna crisis in 1928, women who are chained to marriages, not because necessarily of recalcitrant husbands, but because their husbands are missing, particularly after World War I. I am convinced, writes Zukro, that the future of Judaism lies in the hands of the modern Orthodox rabbi, meaning that there's a species of rabbi in traditional Jewish life who is particularly capable of solving some of the major dilemmas in Jewish life. But there's a question of how much of this is practical and how much of this is theoretical. One person who really stepped up to try to solve this issue, again, whether practical or pragmatic or simply ideological, is Rabbi Louie Epstein. I've given you the very first page in his work of Hafkas Kedushin, of annulling marriage for the sake, retroactively annulling a marriage when a woman is chained, stuck in their marriage, she cannot be given a divorce according to Jewish law, at least traditional interpretations of Jewish law. Can we solve that? And Epstein was at the forefront of it. And one item about sort of as we think about the parting of the ways is that Epstein is dispatched by the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards, meaning that eventually the Rabbinical Assembly, which is the rabbinic arm of conservative Judaism, and the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is the rabbinical school, and to a lesser but still very much certain extent is the United Synagogue, the congregational wing of the conservative, of this emerging conservative movement, furnishes a rabbinic body, a halachic body. What does that mean? What are the implications for creating an official or semi-official rabbinical organization that deals with halachic issues? Ben, go ahead.
One thing it's important to consider is that while they're making this body, the Jewish Theological Seminary long had a Beit Din that dealt with more traditional issues of marriage and divorce. And so what we're seeing is a gradual expansion of an earlier institution in the movement of Epstein to aid agunot in a more comprehensive manner than had been dealt with before.
Yeah, Zach?
I was just going to say, whenever you build institutions, whether they be physical manifestations or whether they be programs of some sort, you give a certain authority in some way that had not been there before. We'll talk about this, but where if you create a book of philosophy, that's one thing. Those are ideas, okay? Solomon Schechter wrote a lot about Catholic Israel and the idea that we are all one Jewish people with one common mission, and it's a vague term, and simultaneously it's helpful in the idea that we are all Kahal Yisrael, we are all the community of Israel. That's lovely, and it's also abstract, and it becomes a little bit more threatening when if you don't particularly like that viewpoint, when it becomes institutionalized, particularly if it's Jewish law. Suddenly somebody else is trying to say, how is the Jewish people going to act in a very tangible way? And you might not like that. Following ideas is one thing, it's abstract, and following a concrete, this is how we're going to act, is another.
Right. And so people try to straddle both sides of the fence. So here's an advertisement that appears in the 1920s in the American Hebrew, which is a New York-based traditional Jewish publication, a weekly newspaper. Prominent rabbi, forceful orator, successful organizer. So it's not a synagogue looking for a rabbi, it's a rabbi looking for a synagogue. Well-known scholar, 43 years old, at present in charge of a large congregation in the South. A friend of mine thought he could identify who this was, would consider change a pulpit. So he's willing to take offers. Only conservative or modern Orthodox congregation desired. So here you have somebody who understands the politics of exactly what Zach was talking about the delicacy of aligning yourself with such fidelity to a rabbinical body, to this arbiter of halacha, while at the same time also putting an option, so to speak, on what this modern Orthodox term and all of what it's freighted, all the meaning that's freighted inside of it. Not everybody can get behind it, though. So here, Yeshiva University, the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary, its rabbinical placement official, Sam Czar, offers the following to a congregation in Omaha, Nebraska in August 1928. This is from the YU archives. Please advise, unfortunately we don't have a letter to Czar, we just have a letter from him. Please advise by wire what you mean by modern Orthodox congregation, meaning that we don't have the letter, but apparently this congregation in Omaha, Nebraska petitioned Yeshiva REITs to provide a modern Orthodox rabbi for their modern Orthodox congregation. Czar says, not so fast. What do you mean by modern Orthodox congregation? Our graduates, referring to REITs, while American-born, modern in the fullest sense of the word, are, however, again, Rudnick used the same language about KI, strictly Orthodox. Do you intend to have family pews in your synagogue? So it's not just KI. It seems that these terms are overflowing in the traditional Jewish sector of American life. And then I'll open it up after this. It works the other direction as well. So Eugene Cohn, who is a devotee, Rabbi Eugene Cohn is a devotee of Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, who represents the left flank to a certain extent, although Zach will interpret a little differently, of conservative Judaism. He writes in his book, The Future of Judaism in America in 1934, still in this interwar period, the very names by which so-called conservative Jews sometimes designate their allegiance are significant of the absence of a strongly felt affirmative principle. So he's complaining that if we are conservative Jews, let's use the term. They speak instead of their congregations as being semi-reformed or modern Orthodox, permitting their attitude to reform and orthodoxy to constitute the sole definition of their own position. So what does this tell us, though, about the psyche of what we now would call a conservative movement? We can go to the next slide.
So I think it boils down to like the question of declarative principles. There's no Pittsburgh platform like the Reform have in 1886, where the Reform all but declared Cincinnati, of all places, to be the New Jerusalem. And we don't have any, while I'm kind of in the camp of Professor Cohen, who you had in a couple weeks ago, of what is the founding of conservative Judaism. It's the ideology espoused by Schechter in his speeches and in other places. And simultaneously, there's no like declarative "we are X," and that was clearly frustrating to Eugene Cohn. He's not the only person it's frustrating to.
That's unique.
So what that looks like on the ground in particular is frustrating. JTS knows who it is. Certainly under Finkelstein, as we'll see, Louie Finkelstein, the chancellor, beginning in 1940 and all the way out to 1965, which is a lot of history. He certainly knows and tries what conservative Judaism is. But certainly in the Sadler era, which is what this currently is, people are looking for identity.
Right, but reform is unique in that way, right? So for the uninitiated, in July 1885, a group of rabbis descend on Pittsburgh to create this 8-plank platform, which, even though there is a debate, eventually it becomes the rabbinic plank. It becomes the theology of Reform Judaism. Orthodoxy certainly doesn't stand behind planks, although certainly Rambam's Ikar Emunah, the Maimonidean principles of faith, have certainly approximated religious theology. Mark Shapiro has written a very fine book on the subject. And conservative Judaism also doesn't stand behind, it's tried in different incarnations, certainly in the 20s, and then Gordis in the late 1980s tries it again. But it's really reform that can stand behind a statement of principles. For traditional Judaism, that is dealing with the migration of culture and traditional Jewish life and so many rabbinical customs and folkways, they don't get to do that. They don't have the luxury of having a canonized theology. That's I think it's part of the challenge, not just in defining what is the halachic milieu, as we saw with Zucrow, of what a modern Orthodox or conservative rabbi must be, but also theologically what they are. And all of these names, which Cohn is exasperated, they become, everything becomes bollocksed. It's not clear. And he's making a call, if we're going to be conservative Jews, let's call ourselves that. Meanwhile, and here's Rabbi Leo Young, the rabbi of the Jewish Center in Manhattan on 86th Street, very close, of course. Kaplan, Mordechai Kaplan was the founding rabbi of the Jewish Center. Leo Young would get the position perhaps somewhat because he was one of the earliest antagonists of Kaplan. He also, in the 1930s, he starts what originally begins, incubated within the Orthodox Union, the Rabbinical Council of America, which is formed in 1935, initially mostly of graduates of the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary. It becomes the Alumni Association. They like to call themselves that. And then in the early 1940s, they're joined by the Rabbinical Alumni of Hebrew Theological College in Chicago. And so, but my point in bringing this slide is that just like these proto-conservative Jews are thinking about nomenclature and organization and how they should structure themselves, these American-trained, although Leo Young is not trained in America, but adopts it really in full swing in his long career, there is an emerging class of Orthodox rabbis who are also embracing America and creating the levers to identify with institutions. They're institution building as well. And here I've given on the left, and it's a marvelous image. I'll minimize us that Zach will introduce for us. And on the right, Louie Finkelstein, who's the longtime chancellor of the seminary and a student, certainly of Solomon Schechter, but also of Kaplan, when he's not yet chancellor, but when he is the president of the rabbinical alumni of the Jewish Theological Seminary, delivers a very important lecture at the Rabbinical Assembly, at their rabbinical body, titled "The Things That Unite Us." And his vision for a big tent conservative Judaism, he didn't use the term certainly, is informing a lot of the challenges of creating a bona fide or a discrete conservative movement. But Zach, maybe I'll pass it on to you for a lengthier discussion.
Great. So firstly, just the idea of images are important, and this is a beautiful one that goes way back. So the picture is Rabbi Finkelstein, who would be the chancellor in 1940, Mordechai Kaplan, who is at the seminary for an extremely long time, from 1909 to 1961. Alexander Marx, who is the renowned librarian, really brings the Jewish Theological Seminary Library to be what it is, from everywhere from Alexandria and everywhere else. The thing about this document in 1927, The Things That Unite Us, is quite important for when it was published, and simultaneously, it also marks how different Finkelstein would be when he was a chancellor. This particular document is, for lack of a better word, sectarian. He makes the claim, for example, about the unity of the seminary. Here's a quote: "Through it," meaning the seminary, "we become not only comrades in arms, but also brothers. After we have said everything about our similarities and likenesses, there remains but one thing to be said. That is, we are all of us, quote unquote, seminary men." So the gender nature obviously stands out in 2020. But beyond that, I also think that it's stating we're seminary, like this is who we are. We are literally, if you've been to JTS on 122nd, it's literally a tower. Okay, we are literally in an ivory tower, not literally ivory, but it's literally a tower. And we need to buckle down and study Wissenschaft des Judentums, the science of Judaism, and that's going to be our goal as we spread out. Michael Greenbaum, Louie Finkelstein's biographer, makes an important point. This book, The Tradition and Change, which was edited by Mordechai Waxman, was published in 1958, and there's section 2 is called The Philosophies of Conservative Judaism. And there are seven outlooks, seven edited speeches that come from that particular section 2. And every single one except the 1927 vision of the seminary, the things that unite us, is a universalistic view. The seminary needs to be a beacon for all of Judaism. In the picture that you showed of him on Time magazine, there's an eternal light which is shining behind him. The eternal light, it's obviously a literal light in synagogues. It's also a metaphor for the light that the Jewish people are still shining on. And it was also the name of the broadcast network that the seminary put out, both in radio and also later in television, that they wanted to be the beacon of, this is what Judaism is for the entire country. In later years, in 1939, not long after the 1927 speech, Finkelstein would initiate the Conference of Science, Religion, and Politics. And he'd invite such luminaries as Einstein, for example, in 1939. Heschel, who had just arrived, Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was at that point in Cincinnati, but he had just arrived as a refugee fleeing from Europe, thank God, and Einstein as well, for that matter. And he'd bring together these brilliant minds from across the field at the seminary, not because he wanted to make the conservative Jewish vision and bring it out to the world, but rather, this is Judaism. We are the eternal light, and we're going to shine it outward, and we're going to bring religion largely out to the world. And we'll touch on this in one moment as well, but there's something significant about the fact as well that Finkelstein is taking over in 1940, obviously against the backdrop of the Nazi atrocities that are happening in Europe. And Finkelstein isn't alone here, but he's one of the significant voices in America. Certainly there are lots of voices across the street at Union Theological Seminary, the Christian seminary, but there was a real feeling that this vital center, which is a term that shows up explicitly in the book by that name in 1947, but that the Nazis are able to gain traction in Europe because there's a nihilism in society. People don't have what to latch onto. They don't have meaning. They don't have religion. And in bringing religion out into the world is actually like the mission of the seminary is to fight Nazi ideals. If I can't fight them physically, we are going to fight the ideals which allowed it to be propagated. And thus, what is the seminary in that sense? It's not a particularistic vision of Judaism, but rather we're going to bring out Judaism in the most universal way we can, because if we don't, the alternative is Europe in 1940s.
Right, but so to include him though, and to shift you into your really wonderful scholarship, is that there necessarily has to include someone who has been a gadfly in traditional circles, which is Mordechai Kaplan.
So we touched a little bit on the Agudas Ha-Rabbonim, the Union of Orthodox Rabbis of the United States and Canada, and kind of they've been after Kaplan, they've been after the seminary since the publication of the Jewish Encyclopedia, which was published by Ginsburg, which was published by Schechter, Louis Ginsburg, Solomon Schechter.
There were articles inside of it. It was published by Singer, but they were on the editorial committee, and
yes, these rabbis were part of it. They attacked that, and thus they attacked the seminary. Exactly. At the beginning of the first couple of years of the 20th century. So they've been after the seminary. They've been after Kaplan in particular since back in that day. And in 1945, they go another step in terms of attacking him. They specifically attack him in the Yiddish press in particular, but not only, in 1921 as well. But in 1945, they go after Mordechai Kaplan and they excommunicate him from Judaism. And I think that the New York Times article here, which you highlight,
great titles in newspaper history.
So the headline says it all, quite frankly, and it says two things. One of the things that I suggest is Agudas Ha-Rabbonim is really out of touch with what American Judaism is. in many ways, they're a pre-modern organization. They try and excommunicate somebody from Judaism. But this is America. And if I don't want to listen to you, what does that mean that I'm excommunicated? I can't go into your shul, but I would never go into your shul in the first place, okay? Orthodox rabbis excommunicate an author of a prayer book, though he is not a member, okay? So it's laughably absurd and simultaneously very serious. The other thing that just highlights kind of the disparate nature of views of what is American Judaism going to be is that they burn a Siddur in May of 1945, everybody, okay? We don't have to highlight the irony too much just to realize what that is, but I will. I'll highlight it even more. Ha-Pardes, which you have provided us as well, in that very same issue of Ha-Pardes, which was the Agudat Ha-Rabbanim's document, just the next page, page 2, page 2, page 3, page 4. I don't think you have it here. You're not going to be able to see this, but I'm going to read it for you. Okay? There's an article that says the following: Et hasrifa asher sarach Hashem b'ma enechem, b'ma enechem, more precise grammar there. The burning that was like burned, that God burned, how will we be consoled? This is talking about how Nazis were burning both books. This article was talking about how Nazis were both burning books and people. And it's the page after they, in effect, were noting how they literally burned a Siddur, the Siddur of Mordechai Kaplan, and that they actually had an obligation to do so. The question of, like, what are we, like, what's the issue, what's the question about orthodoxy and the disparate views of conservative Judaism versus Orthodox Judaism? Agudas Ha-Rabbonim is certainly not the focal point in Orthodox history at this point. There have been a variety of other different organizations which have risen. Yeshiva University, RITS in particular, the OU.
Agudas Yisrael has emerged.
Agudas Yisrael has emerged as well. My proposal is this actually highlights what you can't do. You cannot try and to use kind of military tactics, metaphorically, to get rid of people. And I want to highlight a quote from Rabbi Norman Lamb, Chancellor Norman Lamb of Yeshiva University. This was published in 2007 in the Commentator of the Yeshiva College paper. And Norman Lamb says the following: if we want to win people over to Orthodoxy, we need to present ourselves as measured, mature, and moderate people with deep faith and the right practice. But we do not insult others, and we do not damage or condemn them. Coming out with isurim, forbidden things, for lack of a better translation, against everyone else is like another fatwa. When I was younger, there was a heretic by the name of Mordechai Kaplan, and the Agudas Ha-Rabbonim had this whole big book burning party. I thought it was ridiculous to have a book burning in the 20th century. It didn't make anybody decide to become more religiously observant. Nobody who was reading his book said, if important Orthodox rabbis burn them, we're not going to read them. If anything, it aroused interest in people who otherwise would not have wanted to read these books. But in addition, what it accomplished was that it got people to look at the Orthodox as fanatics. That's no way to make friends and win people over to Orthodoxy. So you have this young Norman Lamb who was seeing this event against the backdrop of what's happening in Europe, and he's saying, America is going to be, we need a decisively American Judaism, and whether that be Orthodox Judaism or some other type of Judaism, where we're trying to attract Americans, and that's real. One other thing that you might be asking, like, they burned Mordechai Kaplan's Siddur. Mordechai Kaplan, in 1934, he famously published Judaism and Civilization. Back in 1920, he published his initial article in the Menorah Journal. which...
And of course, he's famous because he is an ex-Orthodox rabbi. He is the founder of the Young Israel movement. He is he starts not the concept necessarily, but the most prominent Jewish center, the shul with the pool, in 1917. He is, if Isaac... Right, without question. He's one of the most pivotal figures. And because of the fact that he is so pivotal, and because he is an ex-Orthodox rabbi, an ex-Orthodox Jew, this becomes a tipping point for both the seminary and for Orthodox Jews. Despite whether or not this might have been a correct protocol in 1945, it signals for everybody within the traditional camp that one needs to take a stand.
Yeah. So the question is, moving forward, what's the seminary going to do? And it's a big decision. Louie Finkelstein, Chancellor Finkelstein, actually doesn't have so much of a choice, to be honest, especially with the way that he's trying to position himself. He's able to say, Kaplan, you're out of line before the book burning, before the excommunication. And he does it repeatedly. Kaplan, even in the 20s, he gets rid of Kol Nidre at his services, perhaps the pinnacle event of the liturgical year. He says, this feels anachronistic to stand in front of a judge. Okay, so he replaces it with Psalm 130. No more Kol Nidre. Pretty heretical. Then in 1941, he creates this new Haggadah, which is actually the first time that he's really panned in writing by his fellow colleagues at the seminary. He writes this Haggadah, and where before it was just ideas that he was coming out with, now it's a liturgical text which people are going to use. So he's being pressed on this as well. And actually in Asefat HaCherem, which you have there, which is basically an article about what is this Cherem convening, they actually mention that this is all the same person that had this Haggadah. It's not just this only Siddur. Asher yad'u v'yistaklu ma shena'aseh la'am Yisrael midei meretzchim ha'arim b'machanot hamavet b'maidanek, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Buchenwald, etc. Okay? He gets rid of Shloch HaMatcha, pour out your wrath upon the people that don't know God. And how can you possibly do that? It's a really good question. How can you possibly do that? Especially in 1941, how can you get rid of Shloch HaMatcha? And yet Kaplan does. The question also becomes, like, why does Agudat HaRabbanim focus on Kaplan? Aren't reformers still out there? Like, Kaplan's not the first quote-unquote heretic in their view. Why not focus on the entire reform movement? It's actually kind of shocking the way that they make the statement. Ki kol Yehudi charad, Yodem a reformer, asher tzarich le'archik mi'itam. Because every Jew, every Haredi Jew knows from a reformer that he needs to make himself farther from them. Aval conservativi, hema mitlabshim atzmam b'yahadut Yahadut moderni b'achareihem yinharu Yehudim Charedim ki choshev shezeu mishelanu. Because these new conservative Jews, which they think Kaplan is, which makes sense because he's from the conservative movement, because he's from JTS, they're like literally wearing different clothes. And I might stream after them and think mistakenly that I'm actually in the place I'm supposed to do. This Siddur has Hebrew in it, unlike Minhag America, which came out in 1857, back in the day with Isaac Mayer Wise, excuse me. So the question of, like, why are we doing this? They kind of try and make it clear, because I'm going to open it up and start davening from it, start praying from it, and
it's where it's where Finkelstein and JTS, they're so broad, and because they've been able to capture that left flank with Kaplan, Agudat HaRabbanim seizes on that in number one, describing them as conservative, and number two, despite the fact that not everybody is a devotee of Kaplan, because they're all part of the same umbrella, they get vilified, and people are forced to make decisions not based on JTS or people identifying within the conservative movement, but squarely at Kaplan. I think that's also, under everything you've said, I think all of that filters down to that very, very critical point.
It's also, I think, important to turn again to the statement of Norman Lamb. He's saying doing fanatical things like burning a prayer book doesn't make us any friends. Well, I mean, Norman Lamb would do a lot in his career to try and make conservative Judaism look fanatical. And I think that actually what the Ha-Rabbonim was doing in their own fanatical practice was trying to say, wait, these conservatives are actually fanatical in a different way, in a very dangerous way. And we need to point to that as much as we can.
Sure. Ben, while we have you, maybe we could slide, maybe we'll go back to Kaplan, but for the time being, there are other elements, not just leveraging the left flank, but it's also the vital center.
Right, so the document that you're looking at here is an arraignment. There's a conservative group that is calling upon a man who refuses to give his wife a divorce to come to the seminary to face the consequences. I want to just say a couple of things about this. First of all, this is 1966, so we're moving on now after World War II. Conservative Judaism is coming into its own. And in the 1950s, the conservative movement would amend the ketubah to try and deal with the aguna problem. So just like you have the halachic prenup today in the Orthodox movement, in the conservative movement, you had an effort a similar type of effort to free agunot. The important thing also, though, to note about this document is that it's not actually a beit din that's being organized. So Saul Lieberman creates this new way of freeing agunot through the Lieberman clause.
And Lieberman is the rector of the seminary and its leading rabbinical figure, unquestionably.
But it's also important to note that Lieberman is nowhere to be seen in this beit din that's being created to enforce his own innovation. So on the one hand, you see a move here to make the seminary the epicenter of Jewish life in the sense of carrying out the edict of the Lieberman clause. On the other hand, Lieberman's not involved. And again, it points to divisions within this conservative movement itself in terms of how it's going to implement this decision. So yes, it's becoming more conservative. It's becoming more parochial in a way, the seminary and its graduates. At the same time, you see that there are fissures always within the movement. And really, while they might all call themselves conservative, there really are important factions that are developing under the large umbrella of conservative Judaism.
Right. Right. And what about the role of halacha, and particularly with families and agunot, that is really concretizing a full-fledged, outward-facing conservative movement?
Right.
And
so
this is the successor in many ways to we began with Louis Epstein.
Right.
That baton is handed to Lieberman in this issue, though, generally, to help flesh out what's going on here in this parting of the ways.
Yes. It's also important to note, though, however, that while Epstein promotes a solution that would free agunot in a more aggressive manner, this resolution doesn't really go quite as far. This resolution, well, let me take a step back. First of all, when Epstein is dealing with the aguna problem, he's dealing with husbands who are missing in action in World War I. He's dealing with mass immigration that's splitting families. This here is a very different phenomenon. This is a situation of men who are refusing to give their wives divorces. We know where they are, we know who they are, and yet they're being recalcitrant and they're not giving their wives divorces. So yes, there's a long trend of conservative Judaism addressing the aguna problem. At the same time, the aguna problem is changing. And so there are gradations. So there's both continuity and also discontinuity, and both are very telling.
Right, absolutely. The other element in which really I think combines both points that Ben and Zach have raised is the new sitter, right? If Kaplan's sitter in the 40s, and his Haggadah for that matter, were radical, that the Rabbinical Assembly and the United Synagogue together in the 1940s would adopt a brand new prayer book. They would no longer use the traditional Jewish rites necessarily, but that as an organizational body, as an umbrella, as multiple organizations rather, would adopt what's the Morris Silverman Sabbath and Festival Prayer Book. Really, it signals, I think, both elements. This is something that Mike Cohn, in his book on the birth of conservative Judaism, highlights as a signature moment in the parting of the ways. And here I've given you a little bit of the foreword, and it's talking unabashedly about conservative Judaism.
I think what's interesting, what's particularly interesting here is just regards back to Kaplan. They published it in the same year, 1945.
Right.
There's the conservative Silverman Siddur, and then there's the Kaplan Siddur. And who's Agudas Ha-Rabbonim focusing on? They're focusing on the heretic Kaplan and dubbing him like the beacon. He's an easy target, and dubbing him like the beacon of conservative Judaism, however. And
whereas this is
actually the conservative Siddur.
Right. Part of it is easier target. So
he's an easier. You're not going to target Finkelstein. You're not going to target Lieberman, but Kaplan's an easy target.
Right. Absolutely. And the other thing is, and truth is, Finkelstein's winning, right? As Jews are moving into the suburbs more and more, many of these now, second or third generation American Jews they're traditional leaning, but they're not quite sure. And they're building a community, and they invite representatives from the seminary, from Hebrew Union College, and from what is now Yeshiva University to debate to debate their merits, to have a dance off, so to speak, of which asking the question, which movement should we affiliate with? And more often than not, conservative Judaism is winning the day, in the suburbs in particular. And that's why, no less than the high school yearbook of Torah V'das, maybe it's a little bit too small, but two articles, one by Israel Belsky, who would eventually become Rabbi Yisrael Belsky, a longtime Yeshiva Torah V'das and posek for the Orthodox Union, warns in an article titled, "And There Was Light," referring to Finkelstein's The Eternal Light, and saying, well, the real light is Torah and tradition. In another article, this one by classmate David Horowitz, it was very difficult to find out which David Horowitz this was. The propagation of our eternal light. Both articles suggesting to their graduates, stay away from American suburbia. That's where Judaism becomes conservative Judaism, and we need to stay in urban New York centers. Excuse me. And remain steadfast in our orthodoxy. And then I think a really, really important moment, and we talked about, I think Zach was the one who brought up meaning making, and so much of Finkelstein's platform was to give meaning to American Jewish life. One of the signature moments for Orthodoxy in 1956 was when 11 Roshei Yeshiva, 13 were asked to sign in a very important study that I hope one day my friend Menachem Butler will publish. 2 did not sign, which was Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rabbi Eliezer Silver of Cincinnati, but 11 Roshei Yeshiva led by Rav Aaron Cutler. A question was asked them actually by the leader of the Rabbinical Council of America, Rabbi David Hollander, about Orthodox organizations remaining a part of intra-denominational bodies, specifically the New York Board of Rabbis and the Synagogue Council of America, the latter being defunct, I believe, in 1994. The New York Board of Rabbis still exists to this day. And they say in a psak din, absolutely not. And here I've given you an article from the Jewish Post and Opinion out of Indianapolis, which while mostly New York signatures, 11 Roshei Yeshiva, some from Cleveland, some from Baltimore, most of from New York. The Chicago Rabbinical Council, its leader, Rabbi Kaganoff, Rabbi Ben-Zion Kaganoff, in this article goes, another voice of disagreement with Rabbi David B. Hollander's proposal that the Rabbinical Council of America drop out of the Synagogue Council of America has come from Rabbi Ben-Zion Kaganoff, head of the Chicago Rabbinical Council. And this is very telling and really betokens a sentiment from Orthodox life, really the so-called out of town, out of New York. I do not believe, Rabbi Kaganoff told the Post, that Rabbi Hollander represents the voice of the majority of the Rabbinical Council of America. Kaganoff was the rabbi of a traditional synagogue here in Chicago, but identified both as Orthodox and as traditional. In America, the Orthodox must work within the Jewish community to achieve certain common programs, such as kosher observance, and to raise standards of Jewish education. These gains are made at conference tables with other rabbis. And so, again, it's another moment, very much like the Agudas Ha-Rabbanim's excommunication of Kaplan, where this psak din in 1956, it resonates for some, but certainly not for everybody, certainly not many people outside of New York, in which you had to remain a part of your federation and be in meetings and on committees, Orthodox, Reformed, Conservative. But it's a trigger moment in which very clearly there has been, at this point, certainly a parting of the ways, in which we have a full-fledged orthodoxy and a full-fledged conservative movement. This isn't a document which moves them further away. It just proves that they're very far apart, because even people who say this psak din doesn't apply to us, even the Rabbinical Council of America that votes overwhelmingly not to abide by the psak din, by this rabbinical bull, nevertheless, the fact that they are honoring it and considering it, the fact that, the question is, can Orthodox affiliate with conservative, means that there are two different movements in by mid-century. I think that's
what you point out well is so often a movement of anything, whether it be a religion or otherwise, it's defined by what it's not. We know that you are not us, is what this document says. It's not because there's been any official declaration, but I know it when I see it, and you're not us.
So meaning it's making meaning either positive or by what you are not. And it's not just Chicago. Here we talked about Rabbi Tobias Geffen, who made Coca-Cola drinkable for kosher-abiding Jews. And Harry Epstein, the rabbi, actually a younger picture of Harry Epstein, who was trained at the Hebrew Theological College and becomes a leading conservative exponent in Atlanta, Georgia. They're working together here in Atlanta, signing a declaration together, an appeal to Atlanta Jewry for the sanctity of the Sabbath and kashrut. This is after Geffen has certified Coca-Cola. They're working together, but acknowledging that they're still somewhat apart religiously. It's a fabulous document. And maybe we'll close with this, is that because there's a recognition that there is such a thing as orthodoxy and such a thing as conservative Judaism, it's forcing people to take sides. And here you have a letter from a Denver rabbi, a Rabbi Hillel, I always pronounce it wrong, incorrectly, Kavar, I believe it's pronounced, writes a letter to the head of the Rabbinical Assembly, Rabbi Aaron Blumenthal. After long consideration, this is an archival document held in the American Jewish Archives. I have reached the decision regretfully to tender herewith my resignation from the Rabbinical Assembly of America for the following reasons. And here I've given you the document. Essentially, this is not the seminary that trained me, offers this Denver rabbi. This isn't the seminary that Schechter built. And then finally, I think the last document here, if he's resigned from the Rabbinical Assembly, he joins the Rabbinical Council of America, and he gets a very kind letter of acceptance, a welcoming letter from the Orthodox Union executive head, Rabbi Samson Weiss, congratulating him for championing the traditional Orthodox, inherently Orthodox cause.
I think in a post-World War II world, the seminary is trying to step into a leadership role in ways that are really important for American Jews. There's been national trauma. There has been national trauma. By national, I mean for the Jewish people. And there's been international trauma as well, and American trauma. And how are we going to provide Judaism in a post-World War II era? And that's where the idea that Finkelstein would see this as his role is important. The fact that it changes later also makes sense in terms of the oscillation curve of you become more universalistic and then you become more particularistic, both for Orthodox and conservative Judaism. Just one document from Finkelstein, 1945. The era of isolationism is at an end, whether it applies to the isolation of nations, of peoples, or of cultural spheres. There can be no religious piety without social justice, no lasting economic prosperity without the sense for the spiritual, no political stability without compliance with moral principles. There is one God, one mankind, one law. The spirit of life is indivisible. This reorientation is long overdue. The effort to effect it began with the birth of Judaism, and it is of profound significance that the overwhelming insight into the need of such reorientation should come with a war which has brought the Jewish people unparalleled sorrow. The quote goes on, but I'll just pause there. The conservative movement, if you want to call it that, JTS Finkelstein, needed to bring all of Jews together post-World War II. And after that next decade of the 50s, it makes sense in terms of where America was that both parties, quite frankly, both Orthodoxy and JTS/conservative Judaism became more sectarian. They were also more sectarian before the war under Cyrus Adler. So you have Schechter, Catholic Israel, broad. Cyrus Adler, much more narrow, things that unite us, 1927 Finkelstein speech, broad, World War II and beyond, and then narrow, 1960.
And anything to conclude?
I think I'll leave it at that. That's a really great way to sum it up.
Right, and I think that part of what this does, and it pushes Orthodox Judaism. Once, and I love the term, that once conservative Judaism has become sectarian, that it owns its name, it forces Orthodox Judaism to reconsider. And it takes religious leaders, we've talked about Rabbi Norman Lamb, but it also takes lay leaders like Herman Wouk. This Is My God, which appears in 1959. It presents them with the challenge, or the catalyst, to go forward and say, well, what does Orthodox Judaism look like? And sometimes describing Orthodox Judaism in what it's not, but also more positivistically, what it might be. And so it's really the sectarianism of conservative Judaism that compels Orthodox Jewish leaders, and even the rank and file, lay people, to really think about what does it mean in urban centers, in suburbia, not necessarily graduates of Torah Das, but what can Orthodox Judaism be? And so it's interesting that the parting of the ways and the shrinking and the red lines that are created in American Judaism, it really does force all parties to take stock of what's happened and what lessons can be learned, and to offer color, to offer texture into the possibilities for the future. And that's, I think, really one of the take-home messages and one of the charges really set into motion by the long, protracted period and the parting of the ways of Orthodox and conservative Judaism. So Rabbi Silver, Dr. Steiner, thank you so much. This was a real delight.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of you for joining us.